Hello and welcome to revision tips for CIPS Level 5 Advanced Diploma in Procurement and Supply. This is Module 4, which is Advanced Contract and Financial Management. And we're going to look at Learning Outcome 1, which is to understand and apply the tools and techniques that can be used to measure and develop contract performance in procurement and supply. So we're going to cover things like KPIs, the methods of measuring and improving supply chain performance, the approaches that are available for supply development, and the innovative measures to improve the supply chain. So you may be familiar with the management saying, what gets measured gets done. And if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. So measurement is the first step that leads to control and eventually to improve. If you can't measure something, you can't understand it. And if you can't understand it, you can't control it. And I guess lastly, if you can't control it, then you can't improve it. So there are many definitions to KPIs. We can look at financial and non-financial metrics that are used to reflect the critical success factors of an organisation or contract. And they're used in business intelligence to assess the present state of a business or a contract, but also to prescribe the next course of action. You've got financial and non-financial measures of a contract performance that are relative to those critical success factors of the service. So critical success factors come up a lot, CSFs, and these critical measures that are included in the contract to monitor performance and to ensure deliverables are met. So effective contracts and relationships with contracts can only be established if both parties know what's expected. So they should be communicated to bidders at the bidding stage so they determine the likely cost of contract delivery. And the KPIs must focus on what's important to the organisation. Procurement-based KPIs typically focus on cost reduction, quality, innovation. And as part of your supplier relationship management, the buyer and seller will meet periodically to review performance and plan for any potential deviations from those agreed standards. So it's important that both parties in the relationship know what's required from each of them, and measures such as KPIs that are in a good way of defining such requirements so that the measuring them will inform both parties on progress and the success of the relationship. So they do provide that direction for the supplier, and the needs to be communicated to them before reaching agreement as to part of your contract document. So you do need to issue these as part of your invitation to tender so the supplier knows what they're letting themselves in for. And they'll focus on your key requirements, such as defined procurement criteria or performance criteria, service level agreements, previous performance to identify deterioration or improvement trends, and the performance of other organisations or standard benchmarks. So as I said, KPIs are financial and non-financial metrics that are used to reflect the critical success factors of an organisation. And those critical success factors are those that are essential for a contract to be successful. So what you can see on the screen is the relationship between strategy, critical success factors, and the KPIs. So the KPIs are specific business metrics that have been identified as important. Establishing KPIs enables the buyer to measure and subsequently manage suppliers' performance. Those KPIs should fulfill the following requirements. They should be aligned to your service delivery goals, i.e. your critical success factors. They should be in context of what you're trying to achieve. And they should create meaning at all organisational levels. And finally, they should be smart in the sense they should be specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. So as well as being clear on the critical success factors, there are a number of steps that the organisation should go through in formulating the KPIs. One of the fundamental questions is to assess how something would be measured and then develop the mechanism for doing so. So, for example, an effective department is a very vague and woolly statement. So there needs to be something specific that's defined and that can actually be measured. So step one, Decide what matters. What are you going to measure? Remembering the IPA rule. We'll look at the IPA rule in a second, but it essentially looks at, measure things that are important. From a P perspective, look for problems or potential improvements. And A, look for authority or the ability to make a difference. How are you going to measure it? So what data are you going to use? Does it already exist? And who is going to measure it? Who will collect the data? It's whoever has easiest access to it. Ideally, there should be a shared data source. And how often will it be measured? Do you want to do this weekly, monthly, quarterly? And how does the measure convert into a score? What does good look like to you? Consider what is required by the spec, what level of tolerance is allowed, and will there be any penalties, as well as whether or not any excellence will be rewarded with a bonus. So considerations for developing KPIs should include, can each KPI be assessed and compared objectively? Does each KPI give consistent results? Can each KPI be used to identify issues or trends? And are they all clear and unambiguous? Are they understood by all of the parties? And are the KPIs genuinely used, or do they measure only what is easy to measure? Do each of the KPIs assess only what is necessary to determine contract performance and supplier performance? And are the number of KPIs proportionate to the value, term, complexity and risks of that contract? Are there too many? Are there too few? At what time or intervals are those data collected? Are they appropriate? And do the KPIs identify any areas for performance improvements and encourage it over the whole life of the contract? Is there a periodic KPI review process to ensure that KPIs continue to be suitable and relevant? And then ask yourself, how is data collected? Once it is, what's the process for understanding and interpreting the results? And is it necessary to outsource the collection and interpretation of performance data to an independent third party or a technical expert? So again, when you're developing these, you need to think about your critical success factors, the measures for success, and agree them with all of your stakeholders. So the main purpose of KPIs in relation to contract management is to measure improvements in performance, reward performance, and develop suppliers. Manage supplier improvement to ensure expectations and requirements are met, to improve and strengthen relations with your suppliers, justify inclusion of each supplier in the supply base, and identify suppliers who can no longer meet requirements and who need to be replaced. KPIs should be seen as the drivers of continuous improvement in supplier performance management. So here we can see the advantages and disadvantages of the KPIs. Clearly it helps to motivate compliance and improvement, helps us to manage risks, and supports contract management. We can identify these high-performing suppliers and closer partnership suppliers, giving feedback for learning and continuous improvement. But the limitations are that it focuses only on the measured areas and not the whole performance, which can lead to cutting corners on quality in order to achieve the targets. KPIs can be misaligned with the corporate objectives. They can be time-consuming to monitor and manage. And there is a risk that the wrong metrics can be selected and can quickly become out of date. So here we can see some examples of the types of things that could be measured. This approach starts with the different activities that procurement might undertake and shows the type of measurement which could be used to assist it. Areas in which measurements can be developed include price measures, quality, service quality and delivery statistics, as well as safety measures. So just here are some examples here of the average lead time, product usability, admin, supplier innovation, how it's measured, and what are the costs, risks, and potentially unintended consequences of those KPIs. Now, price measures can include marketplace competitiveness, discounts and payment terms offered, flexibility, estimated timeliness and accuracy. But a simple cost reduction target looks at the historical cost baseline for a specific good or service and compares it with the current cost impact. The percentage variance gives the savings figure or cost increase percentage. A simple supplier scorecard of cost might include factors such as defect costs per dollar spent or euro spent or pound spent, and a defect cost recovered per pound, dollar, euro spent, and the adjustments required for downgrading materials. But the total cost reflects the cost of doing business with the supplier and the contribution that the supplier makes to the organisation. KPIs to measure product quality are often quantitative in nature rather than being subjective. Basic KPIs used to measure quality performance include percentage of products supplied in that period that meet the agreed standard, or that are fit for purpose, or that are compliant with the specification. The KPI is accompanied by a target, for example 95% or 95 parts per million. And when assessing service quality, a point system can be used for assessing performance. So you might earn 10 out of an available 20 points. A world-class performance equals 20 points. But quality can be measured in a number of ways. What you can see on the left-hand side of the screen is David Garvin's view on quality. He says that quality is either transcendental, which is when people can't logically or quantifiably define it, but they know it when they see it, or a product-based approach, which is very quantifiable because you're measuring things like durability, reliability. The user-based approach is down to a personal preference, your own idea of what quality looks like to you. The manufacturing-based one, again, this is very quantifiable because you can use the specification to judge whether or not it meets the requirement or not. And the value-based one is where the consumer assesses the cost against the offer. You can also use the RATA model, which looks at reliability, assurance, the tangibles, empathy and responsiveness, more relevant when you're measuring quality of service. Now, delivery KPIs can relate to service delivery, product delivery on time, and logistics. So the supplier must deliver at the right time, in the right quantity, to and from the right place. And the measure needs to be agreed with each supplier and used as part of the supplier performance management. So examples of these KPIs would be percentage of early or late deliveries and percentage of deliveries over or under the quantity. And you quite often see this referred to as OTIF, which is on time in full. Now, safety is a top objective of any company. It's one of the obvious measures of projects and a success in one of the KPIs during the life of a project. A company may be prosecuted and suffer damage to reputation if it fails to maintain an adequate health and safety framework. The measurement of safety can be broken down into different areas such as accident rates, staff safety training, and availability of resources. And examples of these KPIs might include lost time as a result of accidents or accidents avoided. So just going back to what I said earlier, reminding you that good KPIs, remember the IPA acronym, which constitutes what a good KPI looks like. And a major danger when considering measurements is having too many of them. The tendency is to measure everything that can be measured rather than what really matters. So it must be things that are most important to measure to indicate performance. You must have a potential for improvement or a problem that needs to be fixed, as well as the authority or ability to make a difference. So the advantages and disadvantages of measuring suppliers' performance is that it identifies problems early on, it can drive continuous improvement, And it's good practice for giving constructive feedback which can improve suppliers' relationships. But the downside is it's time consuming, can be costly, and negative reporting on performance can damage your relationship with the supplier. Now, whether the supplier is able to perform or exceed their contractual obligations, they can be monitored in 3 aspects. So you can analyse the suppliers, measure the performance, and then managing the supplier as well. So in terms of assessing relationships, a set of KPIs is outlined in your service level agreement. And it should be very quantifiable set of hard measures, but they don't always allow for the softer assessments of the relationship and how well the 2 parties are able to work together. It's often the quality of the working relationship that determines whether a supplier and buyer will be able to form a mutual benefit relationship or not. So understanding whether the relationship is working or not may require the parties to consider whether the relationship is being suitably managed, contract performance, and therefore the quality of the contract management, operational efficiency, quality of rapport, trust, communication, and problem solving, the fair sharing of risks, costs, and rewards of doing business together, how effectively, positively, and collaboratively problems are solved, the extent to which the supplier demonstrates willingness to go beyond contractual compliance to offer added value, and the willingness for the potential for the relationship to develop further. So methods of data collection. Gordon provides a useful list of methods for data collection. So you can do paper questionnaires, web-based questionnaires. You can take extracts from your current systems. You can do site visits. Ask for certifications such as a third-party ISO or supplier evaluation software. Here you can see a list of categories that you may want to measure. So this is to do with a supplier rating. You can look to rating them on quality, price, and delivery in this example. And then you apply a weighting of between 0 and 1. So you can see 0.4 for quality, 0.4 for price, and 0.2 for delivery, which gives you a whole weighting of 1, which will be converted to a % of 100. Then you score the supplier out of 100. So you've got 2 scores here, supplier 1 and 2. Let's take delivery. One's getting 82 out of 100, one's getting 80. That's worth 0.2 in terms of weighting. So you multiply the factor weighting by the score, which gives you a score of 16.4 out of 20, or 16 out of 20. Do that for all of the factors to give an overall supplier rating, and then you can compare them. And what this is showing you is that supplier 1 is ever so slightly better than supplier 2 with that extra 0.4 of a score. The level of supplier involvement in NPD can be tested using something called the black, grey, and white box classification. So with regards to white box, the supplier has little involvement or is involved in an ad hoc way in the design. The grey box is where the supplier and owner are jointly responsible for the design. And the black box, where the supplier has full responsibility for and knowledge of the product design. So innovation audits can help the organisation to understand how innovative their suppliers are or could be. The approach shown here is one example of a framework that can be used for an innovation audit, as the skills and abilities in the areas shown here indicate strength that a procuring organisation could take advantage of if they wanted to work with the supplier. So you've got things like learning capabilities. This is the ability for a supplier to identify, assimilate, and exploit any new knowledge, which is essential to an organisation's competitive success. You've got R&D capability. This refers to a supplier's ability to integrate research and development strategy project implementation, portfolio management, and research and development expertise. The resource allocation capability is about the supplier's ability to use and expand any technological, human, and financial resources that are available to them in the innovation process. Manufacturing capability looks at the supplier's ability to transform their research and development results into the products to meet market needs and which conform to the design request and can be manufactured in batches. Marketing capability is the supplier's capacity to promote and sell products through understanding the current and future needs of its customers, accessing the customers, and the knowledge of any of the competitors. Organising capacity is the ability for a supplier to cultivate organisational culture and coordinate activities towards shared objectives and influence the speed of innovation through the infrastructure created for projects in development. But this will also include the supplier's ability to manage both internal cooperation among departments and external communication with its suppliers and customers. Strategic planning capability is the ability for a supplier's capacity to identify strengths and weaknesses, as well as any opportunities and threats, and adopt different strategies to adapt to market changes in a highly competitive environment. There is a suggestion that absorptive capacity might be added to the technological innovation capability framework, and this refers to a supplier's ability to acquire, assimilate, and exploit information and knowledge. Absorptive, sorry, I'm struggling with that word. We're now looking at new products. New products are essential for an organisation's success, but new product development is risky and many new products fail. So the time to market is a framework between the generation of an idea and the product emergence to the market. So you can see that from the diagram on the slide here. Now, organisations use the time to market metric to determine how products are developed and to evaluate how a specific project handles competition. So the total cycle starts at the initiation of the project and ends with the first revenue shipment. So improving the time to market can positively affect profit and market share. First mover advantage can be a source of competitive advantage, especially in high-tech and IT industries. It's a concept from strategic management where the organisation achieves competitive advantage by seeing and being the first in the market to launch that product or service. So, for example, Apple iPhone and its constant successful launches of new innovative versions are classic examples of the importance and innovation as well as the time to market. So it is a process metric. It measures the time lapse between when new product development program starts, when you know very little about the ability, and then making sure that the volumes are agreed to ensure profitable growth. But in contrast, the time to profit measures the time to achieve the forecasted profits of a new product. So a comparable metric such as the time to profit should be added to the time to market in order to balance resources and create focus on the ultimate goal, profitability. And once the secrets of the proper use of metrics, one of the secrets of this is to balance the metrics and avoid any unintended results, providing the right balance to all of the stakeholders. So the degree of supply chain integration an organisation wishes to pursue can have a far-reaching consequence on its procurement functions and the systems it uses. So, for example, if it has an enterprise planning system or uses materials requirement planning, it will need to decide whether they can purely remain internal or whether they should be extended to key suppliers in their supply chain. So supply chains are made up of many different elements, both upstream and downstream. And the challenge for us as an organisation is deciding which elements should be integrated. Should it be our suppliers, our customers, or our processes? And the degree of the integration required. So an organisation could select one or two key suppliers and build a fully integrated approach using sophisticated IT systems while keeping others at a transactional arm's length. So something like EDI. Or it could aim for efficient internal processes, but without any external integration. Or develop a fully comprehensive system involving all elements of the supply chain and make suppliers use it as if they want to trade with the organisation. And there are many models that seek to explain the levels of supply chain integration. So for example, Stevens identified 4 stages. So a fragmented internally, stage 2 is some internal integration, stage 3, full internal integration, and stage 4, fully integrated supply chain. Now, integrating your e-systems across the organisation and its supply network is again a challenging thing to do. So here you can see a 9-step model designed to achieve supply chain integration. Step 1, identify any critical supply chain partners. Step 2 and 3 is to develop those supply chain strategies aligned to your business objectives. Step 4 is concerned with the development of internal processes in terms of performance measures. Step 5 and 6 are about improving internal processes and the measures. And step 7 and 8, improving external processes and extending integration to their second-tier suppliers. And step 9, it's important to annually re-evaluate the model to ensure changes can be made where necessary. There is an 8-process step for supply chain integration by another author, which you can see here. This is highlighted by Boxer Socks, Clocks and Cooper. Each product supply chain will have a particularly competitive strategy reflected by the activities and elements in these business processes. But not all will be key for every supply chain. So look at customer relationship management, for example, CRM. This is about tailoring products and service agreements to meet the customer needs and monitoring the impact of customer relationships and the efforts in terms of financial impact and customer satisfaction. Customer service management is about providing information to customers such as product availability, shipping dates and other order statuses, and monitoring and reporting on customer service performance. And then demand management, sharing point of sale, new market, production and forecast information. Order fulfillment is about determining order sizes, distribution plans, communication network requirements. Manufacturing flow is about determining customer requirement changes and translating those requirement changes into supplier requirement changes. And then the SRM, the supplier relationship management, is about negotiating product and service agreements, developing or improving supplier capabilities, and monitoring their performance and improvement. Product development and commercialization is about developing new products and getting them to market quickly and effectively, and assessing the success of each product. And the final one is about the returns management, managing used product disposal, product recalls and packaging requirements, environmental compliance, and substance disposal and recycling. Now, what we know about KPIs is that they're either qualitative or quantitative. The quantitative ones have numbers associated with them, they're absolutes, whereas the qualitative stuff is about how people feel, which means that the quantitatives are objective and the qualitatives are subjective. So the types of numbers we can use in the quantitative measures are shown here. So we've got I guess things like the fact they're easier to establish, easy to monitor over time. They focus on numbers primarily, so it's facts, figures, percentages, rejects rates, price, all of them are essentially numbers that we can record. Whereas with the qualitative ones, they're essentially more satisfaction rates and more subjective. So it's things like staff issues, management, level of technological improvements, and the willingness to collaborate. You could also include things like customer satisfaction. Return on investment, or ROI, is a financial ratio which it measures the benefit obtained from an investment. It's usually expressed as a percentage or a ratio. This can be done at organisational level, department level, or even project level. It simply takes the profit or benefit and divides it by the investment, multiplying it by 100 to give it a percentage. Whereas the DuPont formula on the right-hand side is a tool to assess the ROI and profitability of an organisation rather than a specific project. Successful relationships will involve parties working together for mutual benefit, and this will require an element of sharing of knowledge. But there are different kinds of knowledge that you can share, which is shown here. And the issue here with supply development is how far the organisation and its suppliers want to go with regards to knowledge transfer. Strong relationships are likely to have a higher degree of knowledge transfer, whereas transactional relationships are more likely to be secretive without any sharing. So knowledge can be through in two ways, thought of in two ways, explicit or tacit. The explicit is one that's achieved via a training course, so you're taught it and you can share it, whereas tacit knowledge is something that you get from experience and experimentation, something you need to learn over time rather than be taught. So if someone is shown how to use a new piece of technology, this would be explicit. When they've worked it out and found new ways of getting extra benefits from it, that would be tacit. But it could also be thought of in levels. So you've got data or facts, such as statistics of how a piece of technology can be used. When you use that data, you can create what we call information, which is the multiple facts joined up to form a bigger picture, which you can then turn into knowledge, where you're actually able to use that data and information to manage outcomes and critically analyse the data. But causal ambiguity in relation to technology transfer is lack of understanding of the local linkages between actions and outcomes, inputs and outputs, causes and effect, that are related to technological or process know-how. So here are the barriers to knowledge transfer. It could be that the supplier has an inability to absorb the information, or lack of receptive or motivation. The buyer might lack credibility when delivering the knowledge. You might have poor relationships, or that causal ambiguity due to complexity of knowledge. Now, be careful not to confuse this with knowledge transfer, because they often go hand in hand, but this is about technology transfer. So technology transfer may be defined as the transfer of new knowledge, products or processes from one organisation to another for achieving business benefits, such as higher sales volume, lesser costs, higher profits, or better brand image, which ultimately leads to competitiveness. The process that allows the passage of a technology from one organisation to another, which is basically the donor to the receiver. But formal technology transfer takes many forms, such as machinery acquisition, technology licensing, or intellectual property licensing, know-how and technical services, or good old-fashioned training. Now, there are many models for NPD, which is new product development. And the model illustrated at the top shows the basic stages in the typical NPD process. So you've got concept generation, then you're screening that concept, doing a preliminary design, through to evaluating that design and improving it. And then you lead on to a prototype and final design. Now, the supplier can be integrated into this process at various points. Collaboration may still be limited to only those in the early phases of the NPD, but it could include a number of stages up to collaboration in the whole process, from conceptual design through a product launch. This collaboration is variously termed co-design, co-development, and co-manufacturing or co-marketing. And then we've got ESI, which stands for Early Supplier Involvement. So the typical stages of that are at the bottom, And it's important to note that these are, I suppose, indicative and not necessarily the same in every single example that you would use. So, should suppliers be involved at the earlier stages, or should they be involved at the later stages? Suppliers that are generally involved in the early stage of the process is because they're involved in complex or critical items, or if they're strategic or black box suppliers, where suppliers of simpler, less critical items are generally involved later in the process. Some potential advantages of early supplier involvement is reduced product development cost, faster product development, and improved performance. But the risks also is that you might have financial and time costs for managing that collaboration, loss of direct control over the development process and the design, and the buyer relying on a sole supplier for the development of the core component. Now, the level of responsibility varies to the level of supplier involvement, ranging from no involvement all the way to black box design, which is a primary supplier driven, but is based on a buyer specification. So you'll have none where there's no involvement at all. With the white box, discussions are held with suppliers about the spec. The buying organisation makes all the design and the spec decisions. And you can see this arrow at the bottom where the supplier responsibility increases as you go up from white to black. The grey box has some form of informal or joint development. So it could include sharing information, technology, joint decision making. Whereas black box is where the supplier is informed of the customer's specification and has nearly total responsibility for that item. So buyer involvement is limited to review and conclude that the item meets the specification. Continuous improvement is the ongoing improvements of products and services. So a commitment to continuous improvement can be built into long-term contracts with targets and performance measures, periodically reviewed and updated. So the plan, do, check, act model is a method for using to solve problems and carrying out change. So the P for plan is to identify the problem or opportunity for change. In the do phase, we develop and test a potential solution. In the check phase, we measure how effective the solution was and determine if it can be improved any further. And then in the act phase, we implement the successful change on a wider scale and continue to assess the results. Now, with a large number of suppliers and limited resources, not every supplier in the supply chain can be involved in supply development. As this is a costly process, the number of suppliers must necessarily be limited. And a supply-based reduction is useful for a number of reasons. So supply development costs are reduced with a smaller supply base. Close and longer-term relationships can only be developed with a limited number of suppliers. And only a number of suppliers can be receiving substantial business. So a large number of quantitative factors like cost reductions and qualitative factors like strategic criteria will need to be considered as part of a supplier selection process. Both supplier practices, whether that be managerial, quality or financial, and their capabilities in terms of co-design, cost reduction and technical skills need to be considered in a strategic supplier evaluation. An important distinction must also be drawn between performance and capability. So performance and capability are the two key dimensions of supplier's ability. Performance can be defined as the supplier's proven ability to meet a purchaser's short-term requirement in terms of cost, quality, service. And performance factors are generally quantitative, i.e. easy to measure, whereas the capabilities refer to a supplier's future potential, which can be used for a buyer to get the advantage in the longer term. But they're mostly qualitative and much more difficult to measure. So here we can see a performance capability matrix that's proposed by Sarkar and Morfatara. The purpose of this is that the supplier is in a performance capability matrix and determined by the supplier, ranking it in the two-factor categories, capability and performance. So capability is at the top, performance is down the left-hand side. The diagonal line, which extends from the top left corner to the bottom right corner, divides the suppliers into three classes: balanced suppliers, motivated suppliers, and demotivated suppliers. All suppliers positioned on the diagonal line are balanced. These are deemed to have the performance level that matches their capability. Any supplier who sits below the diagonal line, such as E, D, and B, are deemed to be underperforming and are classed as demotivated suppliers. These suppliers may not be able to work to their capabilities either because they're unable to use their capabilities effectively or because they don't know how to operate within the framework of the buyer-supplier relationship. The suppliers who sit above that diagonal line, as in the A, C, F, and G, are deemed to have performed beyond their capabilities and are classed as motivated suppliers. These suppliers either have a lot resting on doing business with the buyer or are able to efficiently capitalise on their capability. And when you're using this matrix to rank suppliers for the development of a long-term relationship, the highest ranking suppliers are at the top left-hand corner of the matrix, E and C. The lower ranking associated with the supplier's position is on the diagonal line. Now, there is a wide range of criteria against which suppliers can be assessed. Quality, cost, and time are the most conventional, but more strategic measures have been introduced relating to supplier capabilities. So one that you've probably seen regularly in previous books is Carter's 10 Cs, which is a model that was developed to evaluate the risks of procuring goods or services from a particular supplier or contractor. The model is only an indication of the potential risk or indeed value associated with any provider, and it should be seen as part of the overall evaluation process, which will also include physical site visits and financial checks. And weightings could be attached to each of these criteria to reflect the context of the procurement, i.e. whether it's routine or strategic. But you can also see, if you pause this slide, you can see that there's also a model that was developed by Lyson and Farringdon and one by Monzeca. A roadmap allows an organisation to understand, influence and manage the development time of new technologies, ensuring that they're able to be delivered at time when they're needed. Now, technology roadmaps may be shared with a specific supplier under a non-disclosure agreement as part of a broader general agreement. But it's important to understand a supplier's investment plans. What are their plans for capital investment to take the business forward? In high technology industries, there may be a need to ensure that technology roadmaps to the vendor and supplier are convergently comparable. They're essentially the organisations involved in the development of new products, especially in industries where the pace of technology change is rapid. So in order to obtain the maximum strategic benefits from integration with a supplier, you must ensure the supplier shares its objectives and that their compatible future technology plans meet your needs. Now, this integration is commonly described as a convergence of the technology roadmap for the buyer and supplier, but these roadmaps describe the performance, cost and technological characteristics of any future products that either party intends to develop and introduce over a specific time frame. Now, a report by A.T. Kearney back in 2013 illustrated the key areas where technology or automation is used in supply chains. These include tracking goods, transaction processing, planning support, decision support, and automation in handling across operations. The report recognises that increasingly complexity across the value chain is making technology increasingly essential for sharing processes and analysing information. And the passage of information is an essential aspect of the supply chain and serves a link between its members. So information technology allows real-time online communication across the supply chain. And we do that using things like EDI, which is electronic data interchange, a computer-to-computer exchange of business documents in a standard electronic format. Barcodes, which are optically or machine readable. and that helps you to identify objects. You've got RFID, the use of radio waves to read information stored on a tag that is attached to an object. And the internet, enabling organisations to communicate with its suppliers and customers and other businesses instantly. Now, a cross-functional team refers to a group of individuals from various organisational functions who are brought together to achieve clear, worthwhile and compelling goals that could not be reached without a team. Now, teaming leverage organisational resources while utilising the expertise of the team members. Now, purchasers typically participate in teams dealing with sourcing, commodities, qualities, new product development and service development. And what this does is it forms a matrix organisational approach, which is what you can see on the right-hand side. But this cross-functional team that we're looking at on the left focuses on design, customer, your logistics and operations team, as well as your sourcing team. And that can help us to do things like simultaneous engineering. This is a form of early supplier involvement where multiple elements of a product or service are created together rather than the more common approach of a buyer deciding what they want and issuing the specification to the supplier. So this is where the company and supplier work together during the design stage. It ensures that quality is built in rather than being created as an afterthought. So a traditional approach is for a company to design the product, then ask the supplier to meet the spec. This is the spec for a windscreen of a car, let's say. But simultaneous engineering designs both aspects together. So what's the best configuration and the specification for the windscreen and the car? Now, this approach needs excellent communication, teamwork and commitment to the process and rapid decision making, which is facilitated by small cross-functional teams. So this is the traditional sequential development. So simultaneous engineering is an example of an innovative measure that can be taken to improve the supply chain. So the stages in the traditional approach is the idea generation, business technical assessment. We then develop the concept and the design, create a prototype, and then introduce or launch it to the market. The stages are often separated by gateways at each stage that must be completed before the next one starts. In concurrent or simultaneous development or engineering, the time allocated to each activity or stage is compressed. So activities can overlap or be performed at the same time. But for this to happen, new processes and structures are required, including new product development teams that are made up of different functions of the business and suppliers, concurrent workflows, early involvement of all departments and the key suppliers. And for the implementation to be successful, the approach needs a top management support, a conducive company culture, training and education for employees at all levels, and a multidisciplinary framework. Problems that may affect implementation will include the lack of in-house expertise and training, as well as management support and communication, or an inadequate reward system that has an improper company culture. But the benefits do include lower cost, reduced development time, and better quality. Now, implementing concurrent engineering has reduced manufacturing costs by approximately 14% at Boeing's systems division. Moog suggested that three factors contributes to reduced time, improved quality and cost reduction, which ultimately improves the customer satisfaction. And these three things are the people, processes and tools and techniques. Or actually the tools and technologies, I guess. But in terms of the people, this concerns teamwork, management support, communication and involvement of the suppliers and the customers. For the process, you need a well-defined process that defines the activities with clear ownership and agreed goals to identify problems and facilitate quick decision making. And then the tools and technology, you could use things like QFD, which is Quality Function Deployment, DMF, which is Design for Manufacturability, Six Sigma, which can be summarized as DMADV, which is Define, Measure, Analyze, Design and Verify, as well as rapid prototyping. So here are the 7 steps of implementing simultaneous engineering. Firstly, you need to develop a strategy which needs to be done by the top management, and it needs to be a top-down approach. You need to assess the organisation's existing conditions by benchmarking, questionnaires and performance metrics. Create that culture to increase awareness of the simultaneous engineering methods, providing training to those that need it. Prioritise the improvements based on the results of the assessments at step 2. Plan for the change by involving everybody, setting milestones and analysing the resources that are required. Implement the improved solution, and finally support the implementation. Now this slide illustrates several combined elements. First of all, it shows the traditional new product development process along the bottom. These are the phases an organisation may go through in the creation of new products and suppliers. They may be involved at any of them, but all in different ways. But the graph then shows the cost profile involved in the process, where a commitment to spending the money. So the budget is made up front, but isn't necessarily spent until later in the process, which is where something solid has been spent and the supplier starts to issue their bills for their involvement. Now what this slide shows is that there are advantages and disadvantages of early supplier involvement. So the plus side is, of course, that you will get quicker development, improved specification and manufacturability, so you're not asking a supplier to do something that's not workable. You can enhance the quality and lower the development costs. Assess new technologies ahead of the competitor. Share your expertise and solve problems together, which ultimately will build trust and alliance, exchanging knowledge and information, which improves your understanding of the supplier's capabilities. But the downsides and the problems of this is that longer development lead times if the process has conflicted or inefficient. You may have to invest heavily in intra-company communication. You could get trapped with an incompatible supplier because of co-investment in research and development, or potential for conflict from different groups and agendas. There's a risk if a supplier or technology is unfamiliar, and leakage of information and intellectual property to your competitors. And the final risk is if the products or service are designed outside the supplier, you might end up with dependency. So supplier forums are meetings which bring key suppliers together on a regular basis, and that's in order to share information, expertise and best practice. The format can vary, but the key is that they provide a forum of open communication where issues can be voiced and resolved in a collaborative way. Supplier associations are used extensively in Japan, and in Japanese manufacturing as a formal structure for collaboration. But they're also now widely used in aerospace and automotive manufacturing sectors. So they facilitate the flow of information from the supplier network and the level of effective communication between the buyer and supplier, creating these virtuous circles where best practice and possible positive feedback sharing creates a cascade of learning and improvement throughout the supply chain. Keep suppliers in touch with market developments, increasing the supply chain agility and flexibility, enabling more responsive adjustments to market developments. Supports early supplier involvement and supply chain innovation, helping smaller suppliers that are lacking specialist resources. And it supports the supplier development and sustainability as a result of increased market share, stable business relationships, and disseminated knowledge, increasing the duration and strength of all of your business relationships. So all very positive stuff. Well, that's the end of Learning Outcome 1. Thank you very much for listening.